What if the perfect society isn't just impossible, it's dangerous? Throughout history, civilizations have dreamed of utopias, those shining visions of harmony and order where every problem is solved and every conflict erased. But time and again, these grand experiments have unraveled, leaving behind ruins both physical and ideological, that whisper a warning to anyone willing to listen. From the lofty ideals of Plato's Republic to the isolated monastic communities of the Middle Ages, the pursuit of perfection has a strange way of breeding chaos. And here's the unsettling truth: we're still chasing those same dreams today, blind to the pitfalls that doomed our ancestors. Think about it. How often do we hear promises of a flawless future, whether it's through technology, politics, or social movements? The language might change, but the pattern remains eerily familiar. A bold vision, fervent believers, and then, inevitably, the cracks in the foundation. These ancient failed utopias weren't just historical accidents, they were rehearsals for the dilemmas we face now. What went wrong in those societies? Why did their lofty ideals dissolve into discord or tyranny? And most importantly, what does that mean for us, living in an age where the next perfect solution is always just around the corner? This isn't just a journey into the past, it's a mirror held up to the present. As we explore these forgotten experiments, you'll start to notice something unsettling. The same flaws that toppled medieval communes or ancient philosophical paradises are lurking in today's boldest ambitions. Whether it's the unchecked power of leaders, the suppression of dissent in the name of unity, or the unrealistic demands placed on human nature, history's failed utopias have a lot to teach us. By the end of this video, you won't just see these ancient dreams as distant curiosities. You'll recognize them as cautionary tales, urging us to ask, are we building a better future or just repeating the same mistakes in a new disguise? The answers might surprise you, and they could change how you see the world. Long before the word utopia was even invented, human beings were already dreaming of perfect worlds. The ancient Greeks imagined societies ruled by wisdom, where philosopher kings governed with absolute fairness. Plato's Republic painted this vision in meticulous detail. Over in the biblical tradition, Eden represented a paradise free from suffering, a divine blueprint for harmony. Even earlier, Mesopotamian myths spoke of Dilmun, a land without sickness or old age. What's striking about all these early visions is how similar they were in their idealism, and how blind they were to the messy reality of human nature. Take Plato's Republic, for example. His perfect society relied on rigid class divisions, where rulers were trained from childhood to suppress personal desires for the greater good. It sounds noble in theory, but in practice it demanded something impossible: that people stop being people. Humans don't thrive under absolute control, no matter how well-intentioned. And yet, century after century, we keep resurrecting versions of this same flawed premise, believing that if we just engineer society precisely enough, we can eliminate conflict altogether. When Thomas More finally gave these dreams a name in 1516, he embedded a clever irony right into the word itself. Utopia comes from Greek roots meaning both good place and no place, a hint that perfection might always be just out of reach. More's fictional island society banned private property and enforced strict equality, but even he couldn't resist showing the cracks in his own vision. His utopia had enslaved people and rigid gender roles, proving that no blueprint escapes the biases of its creators. These early attempts reveal a pattern we're still grappling with today. Utopian thinkers consistently make the same mistake. They design societies as if humans are predictable components in a machine, rather than flawed, emotional beings who resist control. Whether it's Plato's philosopher kings or medieval monastic orders promising purity through isolation, the result is always the same: the system collapses under the weight of reality. The lesson isn't that we should stop striving for better societies, but that we need to stop expecting perfection. After all, the most dangerous utopias aren't the ones that fail. They're the ones that refuse to admit they ever could. Plato's Republic wasn't just a philosophical thought experiment, it was a blueprint for control disguised as enlightenment. Imagine a society where every aspect of life, from the stories children hear to the relationships adults form, is meticulously designed by an elite class of rulers who claim to know what's best for everyone. That's the unsettling reality behind Plato's vision. His philosopher kings weren't just wise leaders, they were gatekeepers of truth, deciding which ideas deserved to exist and which had to be suppressed for the sake of stability. Poetry, too emotional, banned; private families, too divisive, replaced with communal child rearing. Even personal wealth was seen as a threat to the collective good. At first glance, it sounds like the ultimate sacrifice for harmony, but look closer and you'll see the cracks in the facade. History is littered with societies that tried to enforce this kind of rigid order, and none of them ended well. Take Sparta, Plato's real-world inspiration, where children were taken from their parents at age 7 to be molded into perfect soldiers. The Spartan system produced formidable warriors, but at what cost? A culture so obsessed with conformity that it stifled creativity, innovation, and even basic human compassion. Fast forward to the 20th century, and you'll find the same patterns in regimes that promised utopia through absolute control, only to deliver oppression instead. The tragedy isn't just that these systems fail, it's that they fail for the same predictable reasons. The fatal flaw in Plato's design wasn't his idealism, it was his refusal to accept that human nature can't be engineered. People aren't interchangeable parts in a machine. They rebel, they question, they yearn for individuality. Even in the most tightly controlled societies, dissent finds a way to surface. Think of the medieval Cathars, a religious group that dared to challenge the rigid doctrines of the Catholic Church. They were branded heretics and wiped out, but their very existence proved something profound. No amount of coercion can erase the human desire for autonomy. What makes Plato's Republic so eerily relevant today is how often we repeat its mistakes in subtler forms. How many modern movements, whether political or technological, promise a perfect future if we just surrender a little more privacy, a little more freedom, a little more of ourselves? The lesson of Plato isn't that we should abandon the pursuit of better societies, it's that we must be wary of anyone who claims to have a perfect blueprint. True progress doesn't come from suppressing diversity, it comes from embracing it, flaws and all. After all, the most resilient societies aren't the ones that force everyone into the same mold. They're the ones that leave room for the messiness of being human. High walls and solemn vows couldn't shield medieval monastic communes from the very human flaws they sought to transcend. These communities promised a refuge from the greed and chaos of the outside world, a slice of heaven on earth where devotion and discipline would purify the soul. The Kluniac Reformers of the 10th century dreamed of a spiritual utopia, free from the corruption they saw in the church. They built monasteries where prayer and poverty were sacred, where every hour of the day was devoted to worship and work. For a time, it seemed to work. Cluny became a beacon of piety, its influence spreading across Europe. But then, something unexpected happened. The more successful these monasteries became, the more they resembled the world they'd tried to escape. Wealth poured in from pious donors, and with it came politics, rivalries, and the creeping temptation of luxury. The Cistercians, reacting to Cluny's excesses, took austerity to new extremes. They fled to remote valleys, wore coarse robes, and banned even the most basic comforts. Their leader, Bernard of Clairvaux, preached that true holiness required total separation from worldly distractions. And yet, within generations, even these rigorous communities faced the same dilemmas. Fields needed to be plowed, roofs repaired, and alliances forged with local lords. The dream of self-sufficiency collided with the reality of survival. Some monasteries became wealthy landowners, while others fractured into factions over disputes as mundane as kitchen duties or as profound as theological interpretations. What's revealing about these monastic experiments isn't just their failures, it's how they failed. Scandals erupted when abbots hoarded resources or bent rules for favored monks. Power struggles flared between those who wanted strict adherence to tradition and those pushing for change. Even in a community sworn to celibacy, whispers of broken vows and secret relationships surfaced. These weren't just moral lapses, they were proof that no amount of regulation could erase human desires or ambitions. The lesson here isn't that spirituality or communal living are doomed, it's that idealism alone can't sustain a society. Medieval monks discovered what Plato's philosopher kings never grasped. Systems don't purify people, people shape systems, flaws and all. Today, we see echoes of this pattern in everything from eco-villages to digital communities promising harmony through isolation or strict rules. The monastic communes of the Middle Ages warn us that no wall is high enough to keep out human nature, and that the pursuit of purity often leads not to paradise, but to new forms of exclusion and hypocrisy. Perhaps the real utopia isn't a place without flaws, but one honest enough to acknowledge them. In the lush valleys of medieval Languedoc, the Cathars built a spiritual utopia that defied every norm of their time. Unlike the wealthy monasteries that had succumbed to worldly temptations, the Cathar perfectly lived in radical simplicity. They rejected marriage, property, and even the consumption of animal products, believing the material world was irredeemably corrupt. To them, purity wasn't just an ideal, it was a daily practice, a refusal to participate in what they saw as a fallen society. Their communities operated outside feudal hierarchies, offering a quiet rebellion against the power of kings and popes alike. For a fleeting moment, it seemed possible to create a parallel world untouched by greed or violence. But history had other plans. The Cathars' very existence was a provocation. By denying the authority of the Church and its sacraments, they threatened not just religious doctrine but the social order itself. When peaceful preaching failed to stamp out their movement, the response was swift and merciless. The Albigensian Crusade, launched in 1209, wasn't just a war against heresy, it was a warning to anyone daring to imagine a society beyond the control of institutions. Whole cities were razed, thousands slaughtered, their ideals drowned in blood. The Crusaders' infamous words at Béziers, "Kill them all, God will know his own," laid bare the brutal logic of suppression. Dissent, no matter how pure its intentions, would not be tolerated. What makes the Cathar story so haunting isn't just their tragic end, but the uncomfortable questions it forces us to confront. When does idealism become a threat? And why do societies so often meet radical visions with violence? The Cathars weren't plotting rebellion, they simply wanted to live apart, adhering to their own strict code. Yet their very refusal to conform was seen as dangerous. This pattern repeats throughout history, from the persecution of early Christians to the suppression of modern communes. The irony is bitter. Movements that seek purity often invite their own destruction, not because they're violent, but because they expose the fragility of the systems they reject. The Cathars' legacy isn't just a tale of martyrdom, it's a mirror for our own polarized age. Today's ideological purists, whether religious or secular, often share the same unyielding certainty that doomed the perfecti. The lesson here isn't that dissent is futile, but that utopias built on absolute rejection of the world are doomed to collide with it. Perhaps true progress lies not in fleeing society, but in transforming it, not through purity, but through the messy, patient work of engagement. After all, the Cathars' greatest rebellion wasn't their asceticism, but their belief that a better world was possible. The tragedy is that no one let them prove it. Even in the 14th century, Geoffrey Chaucer understood what so many utopian dreamers refused to see: human nature laughs at perfection. His Canterbury Tales isn't just a collection of stories, it's a masterclass in exposing the hypocrisy of systems that claim moral superiority. Take the pardoner, a character who sells fake religious relics while preaching against greed, or the monk who ignores his vows of poverty to hunt and feast in luxury. Chaucer didn't just mock these figures, he revealed the absurdity of any institution pretending to be flawless. While philosophers and theologians spun elaborate visions of ideal societies, Chaucer's pilgrims stumbled through the real world, driven by vanity, lust, and self-interest. And that's precisely what makes his work so enduringly relevant. The genius of the Canterbury Tales lies in how it dismantles utopian thinking without ever mentioning it directly. Each character embodies a contradiction: the knight who fights for Christendom but revels in violence, the prioress who wears a brooch engraved with "Love conquers all," while her lapdogs dine better than the poor. Chaucer's humor cuts deep because it exposes an uncomfortable truth. No amount of rules or rituals can erase human frailty. Medieval monasteries preached purity, yet his friar frequents taverns. The church demanded celibacy, yet his summoner has a face scarred by syphilis. These aren't just jokes, they're proof that grand systems crumble under the weight of ordinary desires. What's chilling is how little has changed. Modern movements still fall into the same trap, assuming that with the right ideology or technology, we can engineer away human flaws. Chaucer's world had pardoners selling salvation. Ours has influencers peddling enlightenment in 10 easy steps. The settings shift, but the pattern holds. The louder the promise of perfection, the wider the gap between rhetoric and reality. The Canterbury Tales reminds us that societies aren't ruined by their ideals, but by the refusal to acknowledge that ideals alone can't reshape human nature. Chaucer's pilgrims never reach Canterbury in the unfinished manuscript, a fitting metaphor for utopian dreams. The journey matters more than the destination because the destination doesn't exist. His characters, with all their vices and virtues, offer something far more valuable than purity: a mirror. When we stop expecting people or societies to be perfect, we can start appreciating them for what they are: beautifully, infuriatingly human. That might not be as comforting as a flawless blueprint, but it's the only foundation that hasn't crumbled under scrutiny. In the cobbled streets of 13th century Europe, the Beguines carved out something radical: a utopia built by women for women. Unlike nuns bound by cloistered vows, these laywomen formed independent communities where they could work, study, and worship without surrendering to the control of husbands or bishops. They ran schools, nursed the sick, and supported themselves through weaving and trade, creating a rare pocket of female autonomy in a world that offered few alternatives beyond marriage or convent walls. To modern eyes, their achievements might seem modest, but in an era when women's voices were routinely silenced, the Beguines were nothing short of revolutionary. Their movement began quietly, with small groups of women pooling resources to rent houses in cities like Bruges and Cologne. What set them apart wasn't just their independence, it was their refusal to fit neatly into medieval society's categories. They weren't wives, yet they weren't cloistered brides of Christ. They took temporary vows of chastity but could leave to marry if they chose. This ambiguity unsettled the church, which distrusted anything it couldn't classify. By the 14th century, sermons painted the Beguines as dangerous mystics or worse, heretics undermining divine order. The irony was cruel. The very flexibility that made their communities resilient also made them targets. The crackdown was inevitable. Church councils condemned their irregular way of life, accusing them of preaching without permission or interpreting scripture in ways that threatened clerical authority. In 1310, the Council of Vienne denounced them outright, forcing many communities to disband or submit to monastic rules. Some Beguines persisted in secret, while others were absorbed into approved orders, their radical edge dulled by institutional oversight. Their decline wasn't just a victory for orthodoxy, it was a warning. Utopias that challenge power don't fail because their ideals are wrong. They fail because those in power can't tolerate the challenge. What's heartbreaking is how familiar their story feels. Centuries later, movements advocating for women's education or economic freedom would face the same backlash, labeled as threats rather than progress. The Beguines' real crime wasn't heresy, it was proving that women could thrive outside patriarchal control. Their legacy whispers a cautionary tale. Even the most peaceful utopias ignite resistance when they redistribute power. Yet their resilience also offers hope. However briefly, they built a world where women could define their own lives, and that vision never fully disappeared. It simply waited like embers for the next generation to fan it back to flame. The year 1381 burned into England's memory with the smoke of rebellion. Peasants armed with scythes and pitchforks marched on London, their anger crystallized in a single revolutionary question: when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? This wasn't just a protest against taxes or feudal oppression, it was a full-throated rejection of the very idea of social hierarchy. For a few chaotic weeks, the rebels turned the world upside down, executing officials, burning records, and demanding a society where no man could claim lordship over another. Their vision was raw but electrifying, a return to the mythic equality of Eden where labor alone defined worth. Yet the revolt's collapse was as swift as its rise. After initial concessions, young King Richard II betrayed the rebels, inviting their leader, Wat Tyler, to negotiations only to have him stabbed to death by the king's entourage. The movement's ideals shattered like glass against the cold calculus of power. What began as a cry for justice ended in mass executions, with bodies swinging from gibbets as warnings to any who dared question the natural order. The tragedy wasn't just the violence, it was how easily the establishment weaponized the rebels' own idealism against them. By framing their demands as unnatural chaos, the nobility justified crushing not just the uprising, but the very possibility of such dreams. What makes the Peasants' Revolt so hauntingly modern is its echo in today's struggles. Movements that challenge entrenched inequality still face the same dilemma: how to turn righteous fury into lasting change without triggering violent backlash. The rebels of 1381 understood their oppression with visceral clarity, but they lacked a roadmap for what came next. Their utopian slogan was a wrecking ball, not a blueprint powerful enough to tear down walls, but incapable of building new foundations. This pattern repeats whenever idealism collides with entrenched power. The French Revolution's cry for liberty devolved into the terror. the Russian workers' councils of 1917 were hollowed out by Bolshevik centralization. Even peaceful movements often find their demands diluted or distorted by the very systems they seek to reform. The lesson here isn't that equality is unattainable. It's that utopian energy, untempered by pragmatism, becomes its own undoing. The peasants of medieval England dared to imagine a world without masters, but imagination alone couldn't shield them from the knives waiting in the shadows. Perhaps their true legacy lies in the question they forced history to confront. Can a society built on inequality ever truly be just? The revolt failed, but the discomfort it stirred never fully faded. Like a ghost, it lingers, an unquiet reminder that when too many are denied dignity, even the most rigid hierarchies tremble. The challenge isn't abandoning the dream of equality, but learning from those who paid the price for dreaming too boldly without a way to make it last. Thomas More's Utopia is a masterpiece of ambiguity, a book that winks at its readers even as it lays out a seemingly perfect society. On the surface, his fictional island boasts astonishingly progressive ideals: communal property, gender-inclusive education, even the radical notion that priests could marry. But the moment you lean in to admire these innovations, the ground shifts. The name itself, Utopia, is a sly joke from the Greek utopos, meaning no place, and eutopos, meaning good place. More wasn't just sketching a blueprint for the future. He was holding up a funhouse mirror to the political and religious dogmas of his time. Consider the details he sprinkles like breadcrumbs for the skeptical reader. Utopians despise gold, using it to make chamber pots and slave chains, a clear jab at Europe's obsession with wealth. Yet their society still relies on enslaved people, a contradiction More never bothers to resolve. They tolerate all religions, but atheists are barred from public office, a rule that would have pleased More's devout Catholic sensibilities. Even their famed gender equality has limits. Women can become priests, but only if they're widowed and elderly. These aren't oversights, they're deliberate cracks in the facade, inviting us to question whether any society can truly reconcile lofty ideals with human nature. The genius of Utopia lies in its refusal to be pinned down. Was More advocating for communal living or mocking those who thought it could work? The answer might be both. As a statesman, More lived in a world of realpolitik, where ideals often crumbled against the realities of power. His own fate, executed for defying King Henry VIII, underscores the irony. The man who imagined a tolerant paradise died for his refusal to compromise his beliefs. Perhaps Utopia's enduring power comes from this tension. It doesn't offer answers, it forces us to sit with the discomfort of our own contradictions. Modern readers often miss the book's satirical edge, treating it as a sincere manifesto, but More's contemporaries would have recognized the subtext. Utopians debate philosophy in gardens, but their wars are fought by mercenaries. They abhor private property, yet their economy depends on meticulous surveillance. Sound familiar? These paradoxes mirror our own struggles to balance freedom and security, equality and meritocracy. More wasn't predicting the future, he was exposing the timeless gap between what we preach and what we practice. The real warning of Utopia isn't that perfect societies are impossible. It's that the pursuit of perfection can blind us to the compromises that make actual progress possible. When we forget that every utopia is also a no place, we risk becoming the very thing More mocked, idealists so enamored with our own visions that we stop seeing the people they're meant to serve. That's the irony that still stings 5 centuries later. The most dangerous utopias aren't the ones we dismiss as fantasies, they're the ones we mistake for instruction manuals. The Tabarites didn't just dream of heaven on earth, they tried to carve it into reality with swords. Emerging from the fiery preachings of Jan Hus in 15th century Bohemia, these radical Hussites believed the second coming was imminent, and they intended to prepare the world by force. Their vision was intoxicating, a society without nobles or clergy, where all property was shared and divine law ruled supreme. For a brief, bloody moment, they seized control of entire towns, renaming their stronghold Mount Tabor, after the biblical mountain where Christ was transfigured. But their revolution carried a dark twist. The same zeal that fueled their idealism soon justified horrors worse than the corruption they'd rebelled against. At first, the Tabarites' reforms seemed noble. They abolished feudal dues, distributed grain to the poor, and even allowed women to preach unthinkable in medieval Europe. But as their power grew, so did their paranoia. Anyone suspected of disloyalty or impurity faced brutal punishment. Priests who clung to traditional rites were drowned in barrels. Wealthy peasants who resisted sharing their harvests were burned as enemies of God's law. The Tabarites' leader, Jan Jalivsky, preached that mercy toward sinners was a sin itself. What began as a movement for spiritual renewal became a reign of terror, where the pursuit of purity demanded endless bloodshed. This descent into violence wasn't accidental, it was baked into their theology. The Tabarites believed they were living in the last days, and in their eyes, hesitation was a betrayal of divine will. Historians recount how they'd march into battle singing hymns, convinced God would strike down their enemies. When their prophecies failed, when Christ didn't return to crown their new Jerusalem, their response wasn't doubt but doubling down. Dissenters within their own ranks were purged. Former allies became threats. The revolution began to eat its own, a pattern eerily familiar to anyone who's watched modern ideological movements fracture under the weight of their own absolutism. The tragic irony of the Tabarites is that they mirrored the very institutions they sought to overthrow. The Catholic Church had used fear to maintain control. Now the Tabarites did the same in the name of reform. The nobility had hoarded wealth. Now the Tabarites confiscated it under threat of death. Their story exposes an uncomfortable truth. Utopian movements often don't just fail. They replicate the abuses they claim to oppose. When you're convinced your cause is divinely ordained, compromise feels like heresy, and enemies multiply faster than you can eliminate them. Today, the Tabarites' legacy lingers as a cautionary tale for any movement that conflates ideological purity with moral superiority. Whether it's political revolutions, religious fundamentalism, or even online communities policing wrongthink, the pattern remains the same. The moment you believe your vision justifies violence, whether physical or social, you've already lost the utopia you sought to build. The Tabarites' Mount Tabor wasn't a beacon of divine justice in the end. It was just another hill soaked in blood, proof that no paradise survives the hubris of its architects. The streets of Munster ran red with zeal in 1534, but not with the blood its radical new rulers had promised to purify. When Anabaptist prophets seized control of this German city, they declared it the New Jerusalem, a divine kingdom where the wicked would perish and the faithful would reign in glory. Their leader, Jan Matthys, a baker-turned-messianic figure, preached that the end times had arrived. Private property was abolished, money outlawed, and communal storehouses established. For a few euphoric weeks, it seemed the millennium itself was at hand. Then the siege tightened, the food ran out, and the revolution revealed its teeth. What began as a holy experiment descended into something far darker: forced polygamy, summary executions, and a paranoid regime where dissenters were beheaded as agents of Satan. The tragedy of Munster wasn't just its brutality, it was how quickly idealism curdled into tyranny. Matthys' successor, Jan van Leyden, crowned himself king of this new Zion, wearing robes of silk while his subjects starved. He legalized polygamy, taking 16 wives himself, while ordinary men were compelled to marry multiple women or face execution. The justification, a twisted reading of Old Testament patriarchs mixed with apocalyptic urgency. The same movement that had preached equality now enforced a hierarchy more rigid than the feudal order it replaced. When desperate citizens tried to flee, they were caught and slaughtered as traitors. The very people who had promised liberation became jailers of their own followers. What makes Munster so chilling isn't just its excesses, but its predictability. Isolated by hostile armies, the Anabaptists faced a dilemma every utopian movement eventually confronts: adapt or double down. They chose the latter, interpreting every setback as a test of faith. Famine wasn't a logistical failure, it was God weeding out the unworthy. Military defeats weren't tactical errors, they were signs the apocalypse was nearing. This feedback loop of zeal and paranoia is a recurring script. From the Tabarites to Jonestown, groups convinced of their divine mandate keep making the same fatal miscalculation. When reality contradicts prophecy, they don't question the prophecy, they blame reality. The siege's end was as grotesque as its reign. After 18 months, mercenaries stormed the city to find streets littered with emaciated corpses. Van Leyden and his inner circle were tortured with red-hot tongs. Their bodies hung in iron cages from the church tower, a grisly warning against religious extremism. But the cages still hanging in Munster today whisper a more nuanced lesson. It's not that radical visions inevitably fail, it's that they fail when they demand absolute conformity. The Anabaptists' fatal flaw wasn't their faith, but their refusal to accommodate human complexity. They didn't just want to build a better world, they insisted it could only exist on their terms, purified of all dissent. Modern movements would do well to study Munster's wreckage. Whether it's political revolutions or Silicon Valley disruptors, the same hubris surfaces whenever true believers mistake their blueprint for destiny. The bitter irony, many early Anabaptists fleeing persecution later founded peaceful communities that thrived for centuries precisely because they abandoned violent millenarianism. The difference between disaster and longevity wasn't the intensity of their beliefs, but their willingness to coexist with a world they couldn't control. Munster's cages remind us that utopias turn toxic when their architects confuse purity with perfection, and conviction with a license to erase all who doubt. Renaissance architects didn't just build cities, they designed them like mathematical equations, convinced that straight lines and perfect symmetry could engineer a better society. Take Philaret's Esforzinda, a star-shaped utopia sketched out in the 15th century. Every street radiated from a central plaza like spokes on a wheel, with identical blocks assigned for markets, temples, and palaces. On paper, it was flawless, a city where geometry would dictate morality, where the very layout would inspire citizens to live in harmony. But here's the problem: people aren't cogs in a machine. Philaret's design, like so many that followed, mistook aesthetic order for social order, creating spaces that looked divine in sketches but felt alienating in reality. Fast forward to the 20th century, and you'll find the same miscalculation in Brasília, Brazil's modernist capital. Architect Oscar Niemeyer dreamed of a city free from the chaos of old urban centers, with soaring concrete curves and vast open plazas. But residents quickly discovered a glaring flaw. The city was designed for cars, not humans. Walking from one monolithic government building to another meant crossing treeless expanses under scorching sun. Neighborhoods lacked corner stores or casual gathering spots, the messy, organic spaces where real community thrives. Brasília won UNESCO World Heritage status for its architectural brilliance, yet it consistently ranks among Brazil's least livable cities. The lesson, a utopia that impresses from a helicopter, is often a dystopia at street level. This disconnect isn't just about bad planning, it's about a fundamental misunderstanding of human nature. Take the Prout-Igoe housing projects in 1950s St. Louis. Designed by modernist star Minoru Yamasaki, these towering complexes promised clean, efficient living for low-income families. But the architects eliminated features they deemed unnecessary: porches where neighbors might chat, stairwells wide enough for chance encounters, even doors that opened directly to the outside. The result, isolation and decay. Within years, Prout-Igoe became synonymous with urban failure. Its demolition in 1972 famously declared the death of modern architecture. Yet the real failure wasn't the buildings, it was the arrogance of assuming people would adapt to a design rather than demanding the design adapt to people. What's revealing about these experiments is how consistently they repeat the same mistakes. From the radial symmetry of Renaissance ideal cities to Le Corbusier's machines for living, utopian architects keep falling for the same seductive lie that you can standardize human behavior through geometry. They forget that cities aren't just collections of buildings, they're ecosystems of chance encounters, improvisation, and organic growth. The most vibrant urban spaces evolve over time, shaped by the people who inhabit them, not imposed from above by a single visionary's blueprint. Perhaps the greatest irony is that some of history's most beloved cities, Venice, Istanbul, Tokyo, are labyrinths of alleys and improvisation, places where imperfections create character. They succeed not because they follow a grand plan, but because they've been shaped by countless small choices, adapting to real human needs rather than abstract ideals. The warning here isn't that we should stop striving for better cities, it's that we must stop confusing control with progress. True urban harmony doesn't come from forcing people into geometric perfection. It comes from designing spaces humble enough to leave room for the unpredictable, glorious mess of human life. The Shakers built a world of exquisite craftsmanship and radical equality, then barred the very thing that could have sustained it: children. Their 19th century communes dazzled visitors with sleek furniture, medicinal herbs, and innovations like the flat broom and circular saw. Women held leadership roles equal to men, a rarity in an era when most couldn't even vote. Their worship services, filled with ecstatic dancing, gave the movement its name. Yet beneath these achievements lay a fatal contradiction. By demanding lifelong celibacy, the Shakers severed their own future at the root. Their villages, once bustling with hundreds, now survive only as museum pieces, beautiful relics of a society that forgot humanity doesn't thrive on principle alone. What makes the Shakers' story so poignant is how unnecessary their decline was. Unlike medieval monks who saw celibacy as a spiritual discipline, the Shakers framed it as essential to their utopian vision. Founder Mother Ann Lee preached that sexual desire was the original sin, tainting all of human existence. Only by purging it completely, she believed, could true equality flourish. And for a time, it seemed to work. Converts poured in, drawn by the promise of a life free from the strife of traditional families. No jealous spouses, no squabbling heirs, no distractions from devotion or labor. The communes became economic powerhouses, selling seeds, textiles, and furniture renowned for its minimalist elegance. But the system had a flaw no amount of craftsmanship could fix. It relied on perpetual recruitment, because no children meant no natural succession. As the Industrial Revolution lured away potential converts with factory jobs and urban excitement, the Shakers' numbers dwindled. Elderly members outnumbered the young, and the few orphans they adopted often left upon reaching adulthood. By the 20th century, entire villages stood empty. The irony is bitter. A movement built on rejecting the world's corruption was ultimately destroyed by the world's simplest truth: people crave connection, intimacy, and legacy. The Shakers didn't just forbid sex, they outlawed the fundamental human impulse to nurture the next generation. Their legacy forces us to confront an uncomfortable question: can any society survive if it wages war against basic human instincts? History's answer is a resounding no. From the Cathars to the Shakers, movements that demand the suppression of innate desires, whether for family, property, or personal freedom, always collapse. Not because their ideals lack beauty, but because they mistake utopia for a place where human nature can be rewritten. The Shakers' furniture endures in museums, a testament to what they built. Their empty villages stand as a quieter testament to what they refuse to acknowledge. No paradise can last if it asks people to stop being people. Brook Farm promised something extraordinary, a place where philosophers would swing hoes and poets would milk cows, where manual labor and high-minded thought would exist in perfect balance. Founded in 1841 by Unitarian minister George Ripley, this Massachusetts commune attracted some of New England's brightest minds, from novelist Nathaniel Hawthorne to feminist educator Sophia Dana Ripley. Their vision was pure transcendentalism. Work wouldn't just sustain the body, it would elevate the soul. Fields and workshops would double as classrooms, and every meal would be seasoned with spirited debate about Kant or Goethe. For a moment, it seemed they'd cracked the code, a utopia where calloused hands and refined minds coexisted. But reality, as it always does, had other plans. The first cracks appeared in the account books. Ripley, for all his intellectual brilliance, was no businessman. The farm's initial purchase left them saddled with debt, and their idealistic pay structure, equal wages for all, regardless of skill, meant the most talented workers had little incentive to stay. Hawthorne, who signed on as an investor and laborer, grew disillusioned fast. His journal entries reveal the gap between dream and drudgery. "I have not the sense of perfect health and should not dare to engage in any literary enterprise." The man who'd go on to write The Scarlet Letter found himself more exhausted by hauling manure than by crafting metaphors. Then came the ideological fractures. While Ripley insisted on collective decision-making, not everyone shared his priorities. Some members wanted stricter work schedules, others demanded more time for study and art. The tension between pragmatists and idealists grew until even simple tasks became battlegrounds. When the community pivoted to Fourierism, a complex socialist model dividing labor into specialized phalanxes, it only deepened the chaos. The system required meticulous coordination, but the farm lacked administrators willing to enforce it. Crops rotted while members debated utopian theory. The final blow was literal. An unfinished communal building caught fire in 1846, and without insurance, the loss bankrupted them. Within a year, Brook Farm was auctioned off, its land parceled to creditors. What's revealing isn't just the failure, it's how closely it mirrors modern experiments in communal living. From hippie cooperatives to tech-era co-housing, the same patterns recur: initial euphoria, then the slow realization that someone must clean the outhouses and balance the budgets. Brook Farm's legacy isn't just a cautionary tale. It's a reminder that utopias fail when they assume shared ideals can replace shared responsibilities. The transcendentalists weren't wrong to dream of integrating mind and body, work and art. Their mistake was believing inspiration alone could sustain a society. Hawthorne put it best after leaving: labor is the curse of the world, and nobody can meddle with it without becoming proportionately brutified. The irony stings. A movement that sought to dignify manual labor ended up proving how relentlessly undignified and essential it really is. Perhaps the real lesson lies in what Brook Farm got right. For all its flaws, it created a space where a blacksmith could discuss Plato and a school teacher could learn carpentry. That fleeting vision of labor without alienation, of learning without elitism, still resonates. The farm collapsed, but the questions it raised never faded. How do we honor both thought and toil? How do we build communities that elevate without excluding? Brook Farm's answers were imperfect, but its courage to ask remains timeless. After all, the best utopias aren't the ones that succeed, they're the ones that keep us reaching. The Oneida community didn't just push boundaries, it obliterated them, rewriting the rules of love, family, and property with a zeal that would make even modern progressives blush. Founded in 1848 by the charismatic John Humphrey Noyes, this New York commune practiced something called complex marriage, where every man was considered married to every woman, and exclusive attachments were forbidden as selfish. Children were raised collectively, separated from their biological parents to prevent what Noyes called the idolatry of the family. At first glance, it seemed revolutionary, a world free from jealousy, where love flowed as freely as the community's famously polished silverware. But beneath the surface, this radical experiment was unraveling in ways its founder never anticipated. Noyes' system relied on a chillingly clinical approach to human relationships. Intimate encounters were meticulously scheduled, with older women initiating younger men and vice versa to ensure balanced spiritual growth. Jealousy wasn't just discouraged, it was pathologized, treated as a moral failing to be cured through public confession. Members who formed natural attachments were humiliated in nightly, mutual criticism sessions, where the community would dissect their flaws like lab specimens. The irony was brutal. A movement that claimed to liberate love had turned it into a bureaucratic exercise stripped of spontaneity or depth. What Noyes failed to grasp was that human emotions don't obey decrees. Despite the rules, secret liaisons flourished, sparking rivalries that no amount of group therapy could resolve. Women, in particular, bore the brunt of the system's contradictions. While Oneida touted gender equality, Noyes reserved the right to approve all pregnancies through a eugenics program he called stirpiculture, positioning himself as the sole arbiter of who could reproduce. The community's young women became pawns in his grand design, pressured into relationships with older men under the guise of spiritual mentorship. The very institution meant to destroy possessiveness had become its own kind of tyranny, one where freedom was mandatory and dissent was heresy. The cracks became chasms when Noyes, facing legal threats over his sexual practices, fled to Canada in 1879. Without his iron grip, the community fractured overnight. Former adherents who'd spent decades denying jealousy suddenly found themselves consumed by it, with long-suppressed grudges erupting into open warfare over property and partners. Within a year, Oneida abandoned complex marriage entirely, reorganizing as a joint stock company, the same capitalist structure they'd once vowed to transcend. Their silverware business, ironically, thrived, becoming a household name while their social vision crumbled into obscurity. The real tragedy of Oneida isn't that it failed, but how it failed. Like so many utopian experiments, it mistook control for progress, believing human nature could be edited like a faulty manuscript. The community's descendants still grapple with its legacy, some proud of its boldness, others haunted by its emotional collateral. Their story echoes in today's debates over polyamory and communal living, serving as a cautionary tale. Any system that tries to engineer away jealousy or attachment isn't just unrealistic, it's denying something fundamental about what makes us human. The Oneidan sought paradise, but what they built was a gilded cage where the locks were their own unexamined assumptions. Charles Fourier didn't just dream of utopia, he calculated it down to the minute. In early 19th century France, this eccentric social theorist devised what he called phalansteries, vast communal palaces housing exactly 1,620 people. Why that number? Fourier believed human passions could be mapped like constellations, and this precise population would ensure every possible personality type found its perfect match. His blueprints included meticulously scheduled rotations of work and leisure, with tasks assigned based on individual inclinations, so someone who loved dirt would garden, while those drawn to glitter would craft jewelry. Even meals were engineered for harmony, 7 courses served simultaneously to satisfy the 7 dominant passions Fourier identified. On paper, it was a symphony of human satisfaction, a society where no desire went unfulfilled. In reality, it was a recipe for chaos dressed up as calculus. The fatal flaw in Fourier's vision wasn't his attention to detail, it was his delusion that human emotions could be quantified. He spent years charting elaborate diagrams showing how butterfly passion, the love of variety, would balance composite passion, the joy of combining tasks, convinced these forces could be harnessed like steam power. When early phalanx experiments in America collapsed, often amid squabbles over who got to bake verses, who had to clean stables, Fourier blamed the implementers, not his formulas. His disciples in New Jersey and Texas discovered the hard way that no spreadsheet can account for a teenager's rebellion or a cook's bad day, the most telling failure. Fourier's own phalanstery never materialized during his lifetime. The man who claimed to have decoded human happiness died alone, his manuscripts filled with sketches of buildings that would never house his perfect society. What makes Fourier's failure so relevant today is how eerily it mirrors our own algorithmic fantasies. Silicon Valley's latest social networks promise to connect us with ideal friends using personality metrics, while dating apps boast of matching souls through data points. We've replaced Fourier's passion charts with engagement metrics, but the underlying arrogance remains the same, the belief that human connection can be optimized. When these systems falter, when curated feeds breed polarization or algorithmically suggested friends feel like strangers, we echo Fourier's disciples, blaming users for failing the system rather than questioning the system's flawed premises. The phalanstery's collapse offers a humbling lesson. No equation can account for the beautiful inefficiency of human relationships. Fourier's real mistake wasn't valuing happiness, it was assuming it could be mass-produced. In our age of quantified selves and gamified productivity, his ghost whispers a warning: beware anyone who claims to have reduced the messy magic of human connection to a formula. The best communities aren't engineered, they're grown, one unpredictable interaction at a time. Robert Owen arrived in America in 1824 with a fortune, a blueprint, and unshakable confidence that he'd cracked the code for human happiness. The Welsh industrialist had already revolutionized textile mills back home, proving that treating workers well shorter hours, schools for their children, even profit sharing could boost productivity and morale. Now he'd purchased an entire town in Indiana, renaming it New Harmony, and promised to build a society where competition gave way to cooperation. No more poverty, no more exploitation. Just a community where everyone worked according to their ability and received according to their need. It was the capitalist utopia, a place where enlightened self-interest would align perfectly with collective good. Within 2 years, it collapsed in a haze of bickering, laziness, and disillusionment. The problem wasn't Owen's idealism, it was his blind spot about human nature. Convinced that environment alone shaped behavior, he assumed that fair wages and shared ownership would automatically foster diligence and harmony. Instead, New Harmony became a case study in unintended consequences. Skilled workers resented laboring alongside those who contributed less but received equal pay. Free housing and communal kitchens led to waste, with some residents feasting while others hoarded. Without the threat of hunger or eviction, motivation withered. Owen's son, Robert Dale Owen, later wrote of watching able-bodied men nap in the sun while crops rotted in the fields, a stark contrast to his father's mills, where clear incentives had driven efficiency. What Owen failed to anticipate was the tension between equality and equity. His system treated all labor as equal, whether it was a master carpenter crafting furniture or a novice clumsily mending fences. But people don't experience their own effort as equal. When a blacksmith saw his finely wrought tools distributed to those who hadn't honed their craft, resentment festered. The same dilemma plagues modern cooperatives, from worker-owned startups to egalitarian communities. Fairness isn't just about outcomes, it's about recognition, about feeling that your unique contribution is valued. Owen's experiment proved that even the most generous system crumbles when it ignores this basic human craving. The death blow came from an unexpected quarter: democracy. Owen had envisioned New Harmony as a benevolent meritocracy, with decisions made by those he deemed most competent. But the settlers, steeped in American ideals of self-governance, demanded a voice. Endless meetings devolved into factional squabbles, with idealists clashing with pragmatists over everything from crop rotations to childcare. Without Owen's personal authority to arbitrate, he was often away lecturing or fundraising. The community fractured. By 1827, New Harmony splintered into rival factions, its lands parceled off to pay debts. The grand experiment had lasted less than 3 years. Owen's story isn't just a historical footnote, it's a mirror for today's debates about workplace democracy and universal basic income. His belief that economic security would unleash human potential resonates with modern advocates for wealth redistribution. But New Harmony's collapse asks an uncomfortable question. What happens when you remove not just desperation, but also the link between effort and reward? The answer isn't that people are inherently lazy. Owen's own mills proved otherwise, but that motivation is more complex than any ledger can capture. We don't just work for food and shelter. We work for dignity, for purpose, for the quiet pride of seeing our fingerprints on the world. The ruins of New Harmony whisper a caution to every would-be social engineer. Systems matter, but souls matter more. Owen's real failure wasn't in designing a fair economy. It was in underestimating the human heart's resistance to being engineered. His utopia didn't lack compassion. It lacked poetry, the ineffable spark that turns labor into legacy. 2 centuries later, we're still learning that lesson the hard way. The perfect society isn't the one that eliminates all friction. It's the one that leaves room for the unexpected alchemy of human striving. Karl Marx would have bristled at the idea that his theories belonged alongside history's failed utopias. After all, he famously dismissed earlier socialist thinkers as naive dreamers, branding their visions utopian, precisely because they relied on moral appeals rather than cold, scientific analysis of class struggle. His communism was supposed to be different, grounded in material conditions, not wishful thinking. Yet when his ideas were finally implemented, the results bore an uncanny resemblance to the very failures he'd mocked: rigid hierarchies, economic dysfunction, and a chasm between theory and reality that swallowed millions of lives. The irony is almost too bitter to fathom. The man who claimed to have uncovered history's iron laws ended up proving a much older truth: that power corrupts, even when wrapped in revolutionary rhetoric. Take the Soviet Union's command economy, a system so centralized that bureaucrats in Moscow once dictated the price of bread in Vladivostok. Marx had envisioned workers democratically controlling production, but what emerged was a labyrinth of planning committees where factory managers falsified reports to meet impossible quotas. The result: empty shelves alongside warehouses overflowing with unusable goods, a paradox that would have baffled even the most imaginative utopian novelist. Meanwhile, the Communist Party elite lived in dachas with chauffeurs and imported delicacies, their privileges a far cry from the classless society Marx promised. This wasn't an aberration. It was the inevitable outcome of concentrating absolute power in the hands of a vanguard claiming to act on behalf of the proletariat. The workers' paradise had become a hall of mirrors where ideology justified oppression in the name of liberation. What's striking isn't just how quickly Marxist regimes replicated ancient patterns of domination, but how closely they mirrored Plato's doomed blueprint. The philosopher kings of the Republic became the party apparatchiks of the 20th century, both convinced they alone could discern the public good, both intolerant of dissent. When Polish workers dared to demand better conditions in 1956, Soviet tanks rolled into Poznan. When Chinese peasants resisted collectivization, Mao labeled them counter-revolutionaries. These weren't temporary measures, they were symptoms of a deeper flaw in the utopian mind, set the belief that those who resist perfection must be forced to comply with it. The tragic twist is that Marx himself understood the dangers of concentrated power. His writings bristle with warnings about the state as an instrument of class rule. Yet his followers, from Lenin to Pol Pot, somehow convinced themselves their regimes would be the exception. They built surveillance states to monitor bourgeois tendencies, re-education camps to purge incorrect thoughts, and in the end, created societies more stratified than the capitalist ones they'd overthrown. North Korea's Kim dynasty, with its divine right succession, would have made medieval monarchs blush. The lesson here isn't that Marx's critique of capitalism was wrong. Many of his observations about inequality remain piercingly relevant. It's that his solution repeated history's oldest mistake, assuming human nature could be overridden by doctrine. The gulags and great leaps forward weren't accidents. They were the logical endpoint of any system that prioritizes purity over pragmatism. Like the monks of Cluny or the Tabarites before them, communist true believers discovered too late that paradise imposed at gunpoint isn't paradise at all. It's just another kind of hell. Perhaps the most poignant legacy of these experiments lies in their survivors' stories. Listen to a Cuban grandmother whisper about the meat she traded for her daughter's medicine, or a former East German engineer describe rigging Trabant cars with makeshift parts because nothing better was available. These aren't tales of ideological failure, they're testaments to human resilience in the face of systems that valued theory over lived experience. Marx's ghost still haunts our debates about inequality, but his greatest warning may be the one he never intended. No blueprint, no matter how brilliantly conceived, can account for the stubborn, glorious complexity of real people building real lives. The utopias that endure aren't the ones that force humanity into a mold, they're the ones that leave room for the unexpected, the imperfect, and the irreducibly human. Techno-Utopianism dresses ancient ambitions in sleek Silicon Valley packaging, but the core fantasy remains unchanged, that this time, unlike all other times, human nature will finally bend to perfect systems. Crypto enthusiasts preach decentralized paradises free from government control, ignoring how medieval merchant republics like Venice collapsed under similar illusions of self-regulating markets. AI prophets promise algorithms will end poverty by optimizing resource distribution, echoing the 18th century physiocrats who believed grain prices could be calculated like geometry. Even the metaverse recreates the same isolationist impulses that drove medieval monks into cloisters, substituting pixelated avatars for hair shirts. The tools change, the hubris doesn't. Consider Ethereum co-founder Vitalik Buterin's early vision of blockchain as a trustless utopia, where smart contracts would eliminate corruption by removing human intermediaries. Fast forward a decade, and crypto markets are plagued by rug pulls, pump and dump schemes, and exchanges collapsing under fraud proof that code can't magically erase greed. The medieval alchemists sought philosopher's stones to transmute lead into gold. Today's developers chase decentralized apps to transmute selfishness into cooperation. Both forget that systems reflect their users. When the DAO, a blockchain-based venture fund, lost millions to an exploit in 2016, the immutable ledger was hastily rewritten to reverse the theft. So much for unstoppable code. The parallels grow darker when examining Silicon Valley's obsession with scalability. Facebook's early motto, "Move fast and break things," could have been lifted from the playbook of medieval millenarians who burned villages to hasten Christ's return. Both assume disruption is inherently virtuous, consequences be damned. Social media platforms modeled on infinite growth have birthed algorithmic outrage machines that make Munster's Anabaptist prophets look restrained. Twitter's promise of global connection became a bonfire of tribal hatred. VR goggles touted as empathy machines are used more for pornography than peace-building. The pattern is relentless. Technologies designed for transcendence become tools for humanity's oldest vices. Even the most benevolent tech visions crumble against human complexity. Effective altruists like Sam Bankman-Fried aim to earn to give, amassing wealth to solve global problems until FTX's collapse revealed the rot beneath the rhetoric. The Oneida community's downfall began when John Humphrey Noyes fled accountability. Silicon Valley's titans shield themselves behind offshore holding companies and philanthropic LLCs. The through line is stark. Utopias fail when their architects exempt themselves from the rules they impose on others. What these modern alchemists miss is that technology doesn't transcend history, it accelerates it. The printing press spread both Reformation ideals and witch-hunting manuals. The internet democratizes knowledge while weaponizing disinformation. No algorithm can resolve the tension at civilization's core. Progress doesn't purify, it amplifies. The real lesson from Failed Utopias isn't that we should abandon innovation, it's that we must stop expecting it to save us from ourselves. The next time a tech visionary promises paradise, ask not how their platform works, but who it serves. The answer will likely rhyme with history's oldest refrain, power disguised as progress. Eco-villages position themselves as the modern answer to humanity's oldest dilemma, how to live sustainably without sacrificing community. Tucked into forest clearings or sprawling across reclaimed farmland, these intentional settlements promise a retreat from consumerism's relentless grind, echoing the medieval monastic ideal of self-sufficiency as spiritual practice. Residents harvest rainwater, build homes from cob and reclaimed timber, and share meals grown in communal permaculture gardens. At places like Findhorn in Scotland or Auroville in India, daily life revolves around rituals of collective labor and ecological mindfulness that wouldn't feel out of place in a 12th century Cistercian abbey. Yet beneath the solar panels and composting toilets lurks a truth as old as the Shakers' abandoned villages. Isolation doesn't purify human nature, it magnifies it. The parallels between medieval communes and contemporary eco-villages are impossible to ignore. Just as Cluny's monks grappled with the corrupting influence of donated wealth, modern eco-communities face tensions when outside money floods in. Visitors romanticizing simple living often bring urban expectations, demanding Wi-Fi and gourmet vegan meals while contributing little to the backbreaking work of off-grid survival. The same dynamic eroded medieval monasteries. Lay brothers resented choir monks' intellectual pursuits while shouldering manual labor, and today, long-term eco-village stewards bristle at transient, voluntarists treating sustainability as a lifestyle accessory. Geographic separation from mainstream society doesn't eliminate hierarchy. It just redesigns it, with green credentials replacing religious vows as the new currency of privilege. Governance proves equally fraught. The medieval charter of charity that unified Cluniac monasteries required absolute obedience to the Mother Abbey, a rigidity that later sparked reform movements like the Cistercians. Modern eco-villages oscillate between similar extremes, some imposing consensus-based decision-making so cumbersome that repairing a leaky roof requires 12 meetings, while others slide into de facto dictatorships under charismatic founders. The Twin Oaks community in Virginia, one of America's oldest intentional settlements, famously cycles through power struggles every generation, mirroring the Cluniac Cistercian pendulum between centralization and rebellion. The lesson emerging from both eras is sobering. No governance model, no matter how meticulously designed, can neutralize the human appetite for control or resistance to it. Resource limitations expose another painful continuity. Medieval monasteries starved when harvests failed or rival lords seized their granaries. Eco-villages today face parallel crises when droughts parch communal wells or zoning laws criminalize composting toilets. The Hutterites, Anabaptist communities practicing radical resource sharing since the 16th century, only survive because they enforce strict population limits and industrial-scale farming. Most contemporary eco-villages lack that discipline, leading to scenarios where idealistic newcomers overpopulate fragile ecosystems, forcing a return to the very capitalist systems they sought to escape. When a community in Portugal saw its handmade clay houses crumble after 3 rainy winters, residents quietly sourced concrete from multinational corporations, a betrayal of principles that would feel familiar to any medieval monk who justified eating meat during famine. The deepest irony lies in cultural assimilation. Just as Cistercian white robes became a status symbol across Europe, the aesthetics of eco-village life, yoga, artisanal fermentation, hand-woven linen, get commodified by the mainstream they reject. Instagram influencers monetize cottagecore fantasies while actual off-grid settlers haul buckets to outhouses in the rain. This mimicry mirrors the medieval church's trajectory, where Benedictine poverty birthed Gothic opulence. The pattern suggests a truth as uncomfortable as it is unavoidable. Movements that define themselves by opposition inevitably become what they resist, because purity is unsustainable in an interconnected world. Eco-villages matter not as escapes but as mirrors. Their struggles reveal that sustainability isn't a place you flee to, it's a practice you carry wherever you are. The monks who survived weren't those who built the highest walls, but those who adapted their rules to feed the hungry during plagues or teach farming techniques to peasants. Similarly, thriving eco-villages today, like Colombia's gaviotas, which regenerated a rainforest while supplying hospitals with solar panels, succeed by engaging the world rather than withdrawing from it. The dream of a perfect community will always shimmer on the horizon, but history whispers that the real work happens in the imperfect space between isolation and surrender. After all, the earth isn't a cloister. It's the one village we all share, leaky roofs and all. Universal basic income sounds like a radical innovation, but its roots dig deep into humanity's oldest economic dream, the belief that no one should starve while others feast. Medieval peasants whispered of the moral economy, where lords had a duty to share harvests during famine. The 16th century English poor laws mandated parish relief for the destitute. Even Thomas More's Utopia abolished private property, guaranteeing all citizens a basic sustenance. Today's UBI proponents wear Silicon Valley hoodies instead of tunics, but the pitch is eerily familiar. What if we stripped away bureaucracy and simply gave people cash? The devil, as always, lurks in the details, and history warns us that even the noblest plans can backfire when they collide with human behavior. Take the Speen-Hamlin system, an 18th century English experiment that foreshadowed modern UBI's pitfalls. Facing soaring grain prices, local magistrates decided to top up workers' wages with public funds, ensuring no family fell below a breadline tied to the price of bread itself. On paper, it was compassionate. In practice, it became a disaster. Employers slashed wages, knowing taxpayers would fill the gap. Workers had little incentive to hustle when extra effort barely improved their lot. The system didn't alleviate poverty, it entrenched it, creating a dependent underclass while landlords pocketed the savings. Economist Karl Polanyi later called it a monstrous device that perverted charity into a tool for exploitation. Parallels to modern concerns about UBI are uncomfortable. Could unconditional cash become a subsidy for low-wage employers, letting corporations off the hook while taxpayers foot the bill? Yet some historical experiments tell a brighter story. In 15th century Florence, the Monte del Dote provided dowries for poor girls, empowering them to marry or join convents instead of falling into destitution. The Inca Empire's mitre system required labor tribute but guaranteed food security in return. These weren't pure UBI, but they shared its core principle, that societies thrive when basic needs are met. Fast forward to 2017, when Finland ran a 2-year UBI trial for unemployed citizens. Contrary to critics' fears, recipients didn't quit working en masse. Many pursued education or started businesses, freed from the bureaucratic traps of means-tested welfare. The lesson, context matters. Speen-Hamlin failed because it propped up a broken labor market. Finland succeeded because it empowered people within a robust economy. The fiercest debate isn't about economics, it's about autonomy. Medieval almsgiving came with strings, requiring the poor to prove virtue or piety. Modern welfare often does the same, with drug tests and work requirements. UBI's brilliance is its radical trust in human agency, but that's also its vulnerability. When Dutch utopianists in the 1600s founded egalitarian colonies in America, they found some members contributed eagerly while others loafed, breeding resentment. The same tension plagues UBI pilots from Kenya to Canada. One Navajo Nation program saw recipients invest in livestock or carpentry tools, productive choices. Yet in a Swiss referendum, voters rejected UBI over fears of freeloaders. The pattern is clear. Societies tolerate inequality more easily than perceived unfairness. Perhaps the deepest irony is that UBI's future may hinge on the very force its advocates often scorn: capitalism. Alaska's permanent fund, funded by oil revenues, has paid annual dividends to residents since 1982, a rare example of sustainable wealth sharing. Tech entrepreneurs like Elon Musk now champion UBI as a buffer against AI-driven job loss, reframing it not as charity but as venture capital for human potential. This twist would have baffled medieval peasants, or would it? Their dream was never just full bellies but dignity. The real test of UBI won't be whether it eliminates poverty, but whether it fosters a world where everyone gets to write their own story, not just survive someone else's. That's a utopia worth fighting for, but only if we learn from the ghosts of Speen-Hamlin whispering in our ears. History's failed utopias might seem like scattered ruins, but if you listen closely, they're whispering the same warnings across centuries. Whether it's Plato's philosopher kings or Silicon Valley's algorithmic optimists, the cracks always appear in the same places. First comes rigidity, the obsession with forcing human behavior into unyielding systems. Medieval monastic rules prescribed every hour of the day, down to when monks could speak. Soviet 5-year plans dictated factory outputs to the last nail. Both collapsed under the weight of their own inflexibility, proving a universal truth: life refuses to be bureaucratized. Then there's elitism, the quiet poison seeping into even the most egalitarian visions. The Shakers preached equality but demanded celibacy from followers while their leaders lived in relative comfort. Marx's classless society somehow always required an all-knowing vanguard to guide the masses. Even the tech billionaires preaching decentralization today still control the algorithms. This isn't coincidence, it's a recurring glitch in the utopian code. The moment someone declares themselves the architect of paradise, the blueprint becomes a cage, but the most fatal flaw is the denial of human nature itself. The Cathars believed purity required rejecting the material world, including families and food. Fourier's phalansteries assumed passions could be scheduled like train timetables. Modern effective altruists reduce morality to quantifiable metrics, ignoring the messy realities of love, loyalty, and luck. Time and again, utopias crumble because they treat people as abstractions rather than living, breathing contradictions. Here's the uncomfortable truth these patterns reveal: the pursuit of perfection often becomes its own kind of tyranny. When the Beguines created spaces for female autonomy, the church crushed them for disrupting patriarchal norms. When the Peasants Revolt dared to question feudalism, nobles hanged rebels as warnings. The backlash isn't just about power, it's about the existential threat posed by those who imagine alternatives. Yet within these failures lies a paradoxical hope. The communes that lasted longest, like the Tabarites or Auroville, weren't the most ideologically pure, but the most adaptable. They compromised on dogma to preserve community, allowing for human frailty. Their success whispers a counterintuitive lesson: the antidote to utopian collapse isn't better blueprints, but humility. Not the abandonment of ideals, but the courage to hold them lightly. Today's social experiments, from crypto collectives to eco-villages, stand on the shoulders of these ancient stumbles. The choice isn't between dreaming and resigning. It's between repeating history's arrogance or heeding its hard-won wisdom. The most radical idea might be this: a better world isn't built by those who claim to have all the answers, but by those willing to learn from every shattered dream along the way. Utopia and progress aren't just different goals, they're opposing mindsets, and history rewards one while punishing the other. Utopias fixate on in-point perfection, crafting elaborate visions of societies scrubbed clean of contradiction. Progress, on the other hand, thrives in the messy middle ground, where small victories accumulate like bricks in a cathedral that no single architect will ever see completed. Consider medieval guild cities like Bruges or Florence, where prosperity emerged not from grand designs, but from countless incremental negotiations between merchants, artisans, and rulers. These cities weren't flawless, corruption simmered. Inequality persisted, but they became engines of innovation because they prioritized adaptability over purity. A weaver's guild might clash with the nobility over taxes, but they'd compromise to keep trade flowing. That's the heartbeat of progress, not the elimination of conflict, but the channeling of it into something generative. The danger of utopian thinking lies in its intolerance for halfway measures. When the radical Tabarites seized power in 15th century Bohemia, they didn't just reform the church. They burned libraries to purge impure ideas, convinced that only a total reset could usher in Christ's kingdom. Their revolution collapsed in bloodshed, outmaneuvered by pragmatic nobles who understood that most people prefer flawed stability to perfect chaos. Contrast this with the Hanseatic League, a loose network of trading cities that dominated Northern Europe for centuries without a single utopian manifesto. Their success hinged on something far less glamorous: standardized weights, mutual defense pacts, and fair arbitration for disputes. These were incremental advances, not cosmic overhauls, but they created a foundation where prosperity could grow organically. Modern societies repeat this dichotomy daily. Silicon Valleys, disrupt or die, ethos mirrors the Tabarites' scorched earth idealism, while Japan's approach to urban planning, retrofitting ancient temples alongside bullet trains, embodies the Hanseatic spirit of layered improvement. The difference isn't just philosophical, it's neurological. Psychologists find that rigid idealism triggers the brain's threat response, sparking backlash against even beneficial changes if they're framed as absolutist demands. But when reforms are presented as experiments like Venice's gradual shift from monarchy to republic, people adapt, adjust, and eventually embrace what works. The Guild City's real genius was their acceptance of imperfection as raw material rather than failure. A stonemason in medieval Strasbourg didn't abandon his craft because he couldn't carve the perfect gargoyle. He honed his technique across decades, leaving successors to build on his mistakes. That's the critical distinction utopians overlook. Progress isn't derailed by setbacks, it's defined by them. When the Black Death wiped out half of Europe, survivors didn't fantasize about germ-free paradises. They rewrote labor laws, rebalanced economies, and discovered, through brutal trial and error, how to rebuild a more resilient world. The 21st century's greatest challenges: climate change, inequality, political polarization, won't be solved by purity tests or silver bullets. They'll yield, if at all, to the unglamorous work of tweaking policies, bridging divides, and celebrating partial wins. The guildsmen whispering deals in Bruges taverns understood something our era often forgets. The future belongs not to those who demand a blank slate, but to those who can scribble in the margins of history until their notes become the text. Humanity's obsession with utopia isn't just about building a better world. It's about soothing an ancient, visceral fear of uncertainty. Our brains are wired to crave patterns, to impose order on chaos, and nowhere does this impulse flare brighter than in the face of life's unpredictability. When plague ravaged medieval Europe, or when industrial upheaval tore families from ancestral villages, it wasn't just suffering people feared. It was the terrifying sense that no one was truly steering the ship. This primal dread explains why utopian visions, from Plato's Republic to Silicon Valley's algorithmic governance dreams, exert such a magnetic pull. They don't just promise justice or prosperity, they offer the illusion that someone, somewhere, has finally figured out the rules. Psychologist Erich Fromm pinpointed this paradox in his landmark work Escape from Freedom. He observed that when faced with overwhelming choices and responsibilities, many people willingly surrender autonomy to rigid systems, whether religious cults, political ideologies, or even the comforting rigidity of totalitarian regimes. The Cathars' ascetic communes and the Soviet Union's 5-year plans both thrived on this same human vulnerability, the desperate trade of messy freedom for the crisp certainty of dogma. Fromm's insight cuts deeper than mere historical observation. It reveals that our utopian cravings aren't failures of imagination, but failures of nerve. The most seductive utopias aren't those with the fairest distributions of wealth, but those with the clearest instruction manuals for living. Modern psychology offers a startling explanation for this tendency. Cognitive studies show that uncertainty activates the same brain regions as physical pain, driving people toward absolutist beliefs as a form of relief. This neural quirk birthed the medieval millenarian who saw God's hand in every drought, just as it fuels today's tech gurus peddling apps that promise to optimize love, sleep, and happiness. The mechanism hasn't evolved, only the packaging. When blockchain enthusiasts claim smart contracts will eliminate corruption, or wellness influencers prescribe rigid life-hacking regimens, they're tapping into the same longing that once drew peasants to flagellant processions, the ache for a world where someone, somewhere has cracked the code. Yet history's clearest lesson is that no code stays uncracked for long. The irony of utopian systems is that their very rigidity breeds the chaos they seek to suppress. Medieval monastic rules designed to eliminate personal ambition spawned bitter power struggles over who got to interpret them. Soviet factories, micromanaged to the last bolt, became hotbeds of creative sabotage as workers gained impossible quotas. Even the Shaker's celibate harmony collapsed not from external pressure, but from the internal strain of denying fundamental human drives. These systems fail not despite their precision, but because of it, like a bridge so over-engineered it shatters under its own weight. The alternative isn't surrender to chaos, but a radical embrace of adaptability. Consider the Hanseatic League's trade networks, which flourished not by imposing top-down control, but by creating flexible frameworks for negotiation. Or the resilience of Jewish diaspora communities, whose Talmudic tradition embraced debate and reinterpretation as survival tools. These systems thrived because they acknowledged a truth utopians avoid. Uncertainty isn't a design flaw to be eliminated, but the very medium in which human creativity swims. Recognizing our utopian impulses for what they are, anxieties dressed up disguise, is the first step toward wiser dreaming. The next time a revolutionary manifesto or a tech billionaire's masterplan makes your pulse quicken, pause and ask, does this vision expand human possibility or merely offer a cage with gilded bars? The most enduring societies aren't those that promise perfect order, but those that leave room for the beautiful, unruly dissonance of people figuring it out as they go. After all, the opposite of utopia isn't dystopia, it's just reality in all its glorious, frustrating complexity, and that's a world worth staying present for. Climate change doesn't negotiate, polarization refuses to compromise, inequality digs in its heels. These aren't problems we can solve with grand manifestos or silver bullet technologies. They're tangled, stubborn realities demanding something humbler than utopia, systems that bend without breaking. The medieval Cistercian monks learned this the hard way. When their rigid austerity faltered, they adapted, trading isolation for engagement by sharing agricultural innovations with neighboring peasants. Their survival didn't hinge on purity, but on their willingness to muddy their ideals for the sake of resilience. That's the lesson we've forgotten. Progress isn't about designing the perfect society. It's about building societies flexible enough to evolve. Take our current climate crisis. The temptation is to chase sweeping solutions, geoengineering megaprojects, or radical degrowth mandates. But history whispers a warning. The Greenland Norse clung to European farming practices as temperatures dropped during the Little Ice Age, starving while their Inuit neighbors thrived by adapting indigenous techniques. Their refusal to pivot wasn't just stubbornness, it was the utopian trap of believing their way was the only way. Contrast this with the ancient Nabateans, who transformed the arid Negev into farmland using intricate water catchment systems. They didn't wait for a grand plan, they iterated, adjusting terraces and channels over generations. Their success wasn't born from perfection, but from perpetual tinkering. Modern inequality presents a similar challenge. The Venetian Republic's Monte di Pietà, a 15th century public bank, didn't eradicate poverty, but it offered interest-free loans to the poor, stabilizing entire neighborhoods without upending the economy. Compare this to the French Revolution's radical wealth redistribution, which collapsed into terror when rigid idealism met human complexity. Today's universal basic income experiments echo Venice's pragmatic approach, offering lifelines without demanding ideological purity. The lesson, lasting change works like a keystone arch. Each stone supports the next, but only if the structure accommodates shifting weights. Polarization, though, is where ancient wisdom feels most urgent. Medieval Iceland's Althing Assembly forced feuding clans to negotiate through neutral law speakers, recognizing that harmony required structure, not just goodwill. The key wasn't eliminating conflict, it was channeling it. Modern social media, by contrast, amplifies discord by rewarding absolutism, mirroring the destructive fervor of the Munster Anabaptists. But alternatives exist. Portugal's post-dictatorship transition leveraged dialogue cafes, where citizens hashed out differences face-to-face before drafting their constitution. Like the Althing, these weren't utopian spaces, but messy, moderated arenas where progress emerged from friction. The common thread in these examples isn't just adaptability, it's humility. The Shakers' decline proved that even the noblest ideals fail when they deny basic human needs. The Hanseatic League thrived not by imposing uniformity, but by allowing each city to interpret trade pacts locally. Our crises won't be solved by visionaries claiming to have all the answers, but by communities willing to experiment, falter, and recalibrate. The future belongs not to those who design flawless systems, but to those who build systems capable of learning from their flaws. After all, the only thing more dangerous than a broken system is one that insists it can never break. The dream of a perfect society is as old as civilization itself, yet every attempt to build one, from Plato's philosopher kings to the algorithm-driven visions of Silicon Valley, has crumbled under the weight of its own contradictions. What makes these failures so revealing isn't just their grand collapses, but the eerie consistency of their downfalls. Time and again, utopias falter because they mistake control for harmony, purity for progress, and rigidity for resilience. The medieval monks who sought spiritual perfection through isolation ended up replicating the worldly hierarchies they fled. The tech visionaries who promised digital liberation built platforms that amplified our oldest divisions. The pattern is undeniable. The pursuit of perfection doesn't elevate humanity, it distorts it. But here's the paradox hidden in these ruins. The same impulse that fuels utopian dreams, the longing for justice, for beauty, for a world that works, is also the engine of genuine progress. The trick isn't to abandon idealism, but to divorce it from absolutism. Consider the difference between the Tabarites' violent millenarianism and the slow, pragmatic reforms of the Hanseatic League. Both sought better societies, but one demanded revolution overnight, while the other inched forward through trade agreements and mutual interest. Centuries later, we remember the League's bustling harbors, not the Tabarites' smoldering battlefields. Progress, it turns out, prefers patience to purity. This isn't just a historical curiosity, it's a survival skill for our fractured present. When faced with climate change or inequality, the temptation is to reach for total solutions, dismantle capitalism, overthrow systems, start anew. But history's failed utopias whisper a counterintuitive truth. Transformation happens in the margins. The Black Death didn't end feudalism because peasants revolted against the concept of lordship. It eroded feudalism because survivors bargained for better wages, one contract at a time. The civil rights movement didn't wait for a post-racial utopia. It desegregated lunch counters and buses, knowing each victory would ripple outward. The danger lies in confusing direction with destination. A compass is useless if you believe it points to Eden, but invaluable if it helps you navigate a storm. The Shakers' mistake wasn't their craftsmanship or their gender equality. It was their conviction that society could only thrive if human nature itself were rewritten. Their contemporary, the abolitionist Frederick Douglass, understood something they didn't. Power concedes nothing without a demand, he wrote. but it also never bows to demands it cannot absorb. Lasting change meets the world where it is, not where we wish it to be. So where does this leave us? Not in cynicism, but in clear-eyed hope. The Beguines were crushed, yet their vision of female autonomy outlived their persecutors. The Peasants' Revolt was brutally suppressed, but its question, who was then the gentleman, echoed through the Enlightenment and beyond. These movements failed as utopias, yet succeeded as catalysts, proving that even shattered dreams leave fragments sharp enough to cut through complacency. The challenge isn't to stop imagining better worlds, it's to stop conflating imagination with blueprint. A living society isn't a cathedral to be completed, but a garden to be tended, where the soil is always shifting and the seasons refuse to obey the gardener's plans. As you reflect on these cautionary tales, ask yourself, what would it mean to strive for progress without demanding perfection, to fight for justice without insisting on finality? The comments are open and the conversation is just beginning. And if you've made it this far, you're clearly someone who values history's hard-won lessons, so don't forget to subscribe. The next chapter of forgotten wisdom is already waiting.